Welcome to the last lecture in muscle physiology. So here we'll be looking at energy sources for muscle activities and also other properties of muscles, different types of muscle fibers. You need to know all this information. So maybe within 30, maybe 40 minutes, we'll be able to discuss whatever is contained in this lecture. So at the end of this lecture, as a student, you should be able to explain the energy sources for muscle activities. You should also be able to explain the different types of muscle fibers, especially the slow twitch and the fast twitch muscle fibers, and why you need to understand the differences. Then you should also be able to describe certain properties of muscles, like phenomenon of TREPI, so TREPI, summation of muscle contraction, tetanus of muscles. So all that information should be able to explain. So let's start without wasting much time. So we'll start by looking at energy sources for muscle activities. So muscle contraction requires energy, and muscles work by converting chemical energy into mechanical work. So the mechanical work that you are able to see, that somebody is working out, somebody is pushing something, somebody is carrying something, is because of the muscles that are capable to convert the chemical energy into mechanical energy that you can appreciate as work outside. But that requires energy. So the immediate source of energy for muscle contraction is adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So ATP is formed by metabolism of carbohydrates, lipids, and amino acids. And you know to say in the electron transport chain, there is movement of electrons that is coupled with the production of ATP in the mitochondrion. And also the process of glycolysis can also produce some good amount of ATP, though the electron transport chain is producing about 36 ATP, but glycolysis will only produce a net production of 2 ATP in that process. So you'll be able to understand all that. So this is the first or the immediate source of energy for muscle activity. It's called adenosine triphosphate. So you have this adenine in the ribose sugar where you have the phosphates that are attached. So if you have 1, 2, 3 phosphates attached to the ribose sugar, it's called adenosine 5' triphosphate. If you only have 2 phosphates attached, it's adenosine 5' diphosphate. So this 5' is just showing you the position of the carbon where the phosphates are attaching. Then if you only have 1 phosphate attached to this carbon number 5, it's called adenosine 5' monophosphate. So this is the structure of ATP. So the first form is the adenosine triphosphate. So hydrolysis of this molecule will release energy that will bring about muscle activities, especially contraction and also relaxation. Because for a muscle to contract requires energy, and for a muscle to relax also requires energy. You know that. So the metabolic systems that will provide energy for muscle activities, there are 3 main metabolic systems, and these are called the phosphocreatine system, the phosphocreatine system, that will be the first one, followed by the glycogen-lactic acid system. Then the last one, which requires oxygen, is called the aerobic system. So these are the 3 metabolic systems that will provide energy for muscle activities. So a bit of information on each of these systems, okay? So these are the 3 systems which I've already mentioned. You can see you have the phosphocreatine system, glycogen-lactic acid system, and the aerobic system that requires oxygen. So metabolism of glucose, fatty acids, amino acids can also release energy. So those energy that is being released from this system is used for muscle contraction or muscle activities, because for a muscle to contract requires energy, for muscle to relax also requires energy. Okay, so it's basically the same information. So we proceed by looking at the phosphocreatine system. So the phosphocreatine system, you don't have to memorize the structure. This is not biochemistry. Just remember the names, that will be enough with physiology. So you have the creatine that can react with ATP. So the phosphocreatine system, the creatine is a compound that is found within muscles. It's just a normal compound that is found in muscles. So the muscles would want to preserve ATP in form of energy that will only be used by the muscle fibers. Otherwise, if the energy is stored in form of ATP, there are a lot of metabolic processes that can use that ATP. So I find that the muscle cell can preserve some of the ATP in other compounds, so that if that muscle requires energy for it to contract, for it to relax, for it to do activities, then to be able to access that energy. That will not be used by any other metabolic process. So this is a phosphocreatine-creatine system. So within the muscles, we have the creatine that can react with ATP when the person is resting. So in a resting state, ATP will react with creatine, forming the phosphorylcreatine and ADP. So the inorganic phosphate from ATP is transferred to creatine to form the phosphorylcreatine. So you have this compound here with a phosphate attached to it. Then the ATP would have been converted into ADP. So you have phosphorylcreatine. So if this phosphorylcreatine is not being used by the muscles, it can also be converted into creatinine and stored within the muscles. Creatinine, so you can see this creatinine. So creatinine is an indicator when there is muscle damage, the plasma membrane of the muscles, the sarcolemma is damaged, the creatinine can be released to the circulation. Then the concentration of creatinine in the serum is going to increase. So the serum concentration of creatinine can be used as an indicator whether there is muscle damage or internal injuries. So if a person is coming to the hospital claiming that he's been beaten by somebody, then they have sustained internal injuries. You just need to check the levels of creatinine. So if the creatinine levels are still within the acceptable range, then you know to say that there's no tissue damage or muscle damage. But if the creatinine levels have increased, you'll be able to know to say that this person has been sustained with internal injuries. Then you can justify to say this person has been beaten, okay? Or whatever it is that they are claiming. So this is a creatinine that is also produced in muscles. In renal physiology, is also used for renal tests, renal function tests. So you understand that later on, but it's being produced by the muscles. So it's the same system. So during resting, the creatinine will react with ATP to form phosphorylcreatine with ADP. If you are exercising, the reverse will take place. So what will happen is that when you start exercising, when you need back your ATP, the phosphorylcreatine will react with ADP, transferring this phosphate back to the ADP, giving you back your ATP and creatine. So the creatine will be recreated with ATP, then the ATP will be used by the muscles. So this is during exercise. So when you're resting, the other reaction will proceed so that you store the energy in form of creatine phosphate or phosphocreatine if you want, okay? So the phosphocreatine system is used during periods of high activity. Maybe an example, a 100-meter dash. When you're running 100 meters very fast, what you'll be using there is phosphocreatine system, because the ATP that will be in the muscles won't be enough to sustain you to run that 100 meters. So once you deplete your ATP, the phosphocreatine system will react with ADP, giving you back your ATP and creatinine. So you find that you regenerate the ATP for muscle activity. So during periods of high activity, like cycling or phosphocreatine allows for quick release of ATP to sustain muscle activity. So the cycling of phosphorylcreatine will allow you to have the ATP to sustain muscle activity. So at rest, some ATP in the mitochondria transfers its phosphate to creatine so that a phosphorylcreatine stores is built up in the muscles. When you start exercising, the opposite will take place. So the phosphorylcreatine is hydrolyzed at the junction between the myosin heads and actin, forming the ATP from ADP and that will permit a contraction to continue, okay? The other system is glycogen-lactic acid system. From the name itself, glycogen-lactic acid system. It means glycogen will be broken down into glucose, and that glucose will undergo glycolysis, producing ATP. But the end result there, the end product is pyruvate, but because you have less oxygen here, this is an aerobic reaction. So the pyruvate will be converted into lactic acid, hence the name glycogen-lactic acid system. So the stored glycogen in muscle can be split into glucose, and the glucose then used for energy. The initial stage of this process, called glycolysis, occurs without use of oxygen. Therefore, is said to be anaerobic metabolism. It doesn't require oxygen. So during glycolysis, each glucose molecule is split into 2 pyruvic acid molecules, and energy is released to form 4 ATP molecules for each original glucose molecule. So there's formation of 4 ATP, but remember the glycolysis process itself will utilize 2 ATP. So there is net production of 2 ATP that will be required for muscle activities. So this only occurs when the oxygen is not sufficient, so that the pyruvic acid enters the mitochondria, then to join the Krebs cycle to generate more energy-rich compounds that will provide raw materials in the electron transport chain. So under normal circumstances, the pyruvic acid or pyruvate is supposed to enter the mitochondria in the muscle and to react with oxygen to form more ATP in the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system. But however, when there is insufficient oxygen for this second stage, the oxidative stage of glucose metabolism to occur, most of the pyruvic acid then is converted into lactic acid. So now the pyruvate or pyruvic acid will be converted into lactic acid, which will diffuse out of the muscle cells into the interstitial fluid and blood. So now the lactic acid will diffuse into the muscle, interstitium, and also into the blood. When you're exercising and then you're having a lot of anaerobic respiration whereby ATP is being produced by glycolysis, there will be more production of lactic acid in the muscles. Then when you're massaging the muscles, you can even feel the pain within the muscles. So that is the lactic acid from the glycogen-lactic acid system. Therefore, much of the muscle glycogen is transformed into lactic acid, but in doing so, considerable amount of ATP are formed entirely without the consumption of oxygen. So this is basically anaerobic metabolism or anaerobic respiration, whereby ATP is being produced without using oxygen. Aerobic system, of course, it talks about the use of oxygen. So now oxygen is sufficient. So the first process is the same glycolysis, producing pyruvate. In glycogen lactic acid, you say this pyruvate will be converted into lactic acid or lactate that will now be transported by blood for metabolism and excretion. But if you have enough oxygen, the pyruvate will join the Krebs cycle. So it will go into the mitochondria and join the Krebs cycle. It will be converted into core enzymes, and these core enzymes will provide the raw materials in the inner membrane of the mitochondria for oxidative phosphorylation. That will also produce a lot of ATP. So here only occurs when you have this oxygen. So this becomes aerobic system. But what is feeding into this system, you have amino acids, you have fatty acids, and then you also have lipids. Lipids, which are fatty acids, amino acids, and also carbohydrates. So at rest or during light exercises, you'll find that the muscle fibers will be utilizing more of lipids in form of free fatty acids as their energy source. So when you are resting, the muscles are not using a lot of carbohydrates as a source of energy. They'll be using lipids in form of free fatty acids. So free fatty acids are the first source of energy for muscle activities. So they'll be breaking down free fatty acids that will join the Krebs cycle for the production of ATP. Then if the free fatty acids are not enough, the body will resort to using carbohydrates If the carbohydrate source is not enough, then the body will start using proteins. So the proteins will be the last molecules that can be used for the production of ATP. So as the intensity of exercise increases, lipids alone cannot supply energy fast enough. And so use of carbohydrates becomes the predominant component in the muscle fuel mixture. So you know to say now the muscles will start using carbohydrates, and after carbohydrates, they will start using more proteins. So the proteins will be the last macromolecules to be used as source of energy for the production of ATP. So these are the three systems combined, but maybe the next slide will be better, showing, so this is just summarizing energy sources for muscle contraction or muscle activities. So the first one, we said creatine phosphate system. So the creatine phosphate creatine system, you know to say when you're resting, the creatine phosphate, when you're resting, the ATP will react with creatine, giving you creatine phosphate. But once you start exercising, the creatine phosphate will react with ADP, giving you back your ATP for muscle activities. So you can see muscle activities here, contraction, relaxation, that is taking place. These are muscle activities. Then the glycogen-lactic acid system. So glucose can move from blood into the muscle cells, or maybe it can come from the breakdown of glycogen. So when you break down glycogen, it will produce glucose, and that glucose will undergo glycolysis. That will produce 2 ATP for muscle activities. So if you don't have oxygen, the pyruvate will be converted into lactic acid. So it's called glycogen-lactic acid system. Then if you have enough oxygen, so if you have this oxygen, the pyruvate will enter the mitochondria where it's going to join the Krebs cycle into oxidative phosphorylation that produces a lot of ATP, 36 ATP for muscle activities. Then we have free fatty acids. So you have fatty acids, free fatty acids, we have amino acids. So you can see amino acids and also fatty acids, proteins, and carbohydrates. That is contributing to aerobic system. So the aerobic system is using oxygen to break down carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, depending on their availability. So the first source, we said free fatty acids, then followed by carbohydrates, and then the last will be the proteins in that order. Types of muscle fiber, which is also very important for a student to understand. There are two major types of muscle fiber. Here, we are biased towards skeletal muscles. So we have the slow twitch fibers that are innervated by the alpha-2 motor neurons, which are smaller of the two alpha motor neurons, so alpha-1 and alpha-2. The fast twitch fibers are innervated by alpha-1 motor neuron. So they are larger of the two. So if the motor neuron is larger, remember the conductivity of action potential or the velocity of action potential is dependent on the diameter of the axon. So the larger the axon, the faster the conductivity. So the alpha-1 motor neurons are larger as compared to the alpha-2. So the alpha-1, they are larger, so they are referred to as the motor neurons that are innervating the fast twitch. So the fast twitch will be very fast for them to respond because the conductivity of action potential is fast in alpha-1 motor neurons. So the stimulation will be very fast because the conductivity is very fast. Then the slow twitch, you know, to say the alpha-2, they are smaller. So even the conductivity is very slow. The contractility also be slow. So you have a slow twitch as opposed to the fast twitch. Then the fast twitch, you have two subtypes, type A and type B. So I will explain the different types of muscle fibers. But the fast twitch fibers have a higher excitation threshold and faster conduction velocity. So the threshold is higher. It means that in terms of recruitment, the muscle fibers that will be recruited first will be the slow twitch because they have a lower threshold. The fast twitch, they have a higher threshold. In as much as they're very fast once they're stimulated, but for them to be stimulated, they have a higher threshold. So they'll be the last one to be recruited for them to contract. So the first ones that will be recruited for contraction are the slow twitch. And then the last ones will be the fast twitch because they have a higher threshold of contraction. They have a higher threshold, especially the alpha 1 motor neurons. They have a higher threshold. So for them to fire those action potentials, it takes a bit of time. But once they fire, they're very fast. Then they'll produce a fast twitch. So in this diagram, you have 2 different types of muscle fibers. We have the fast twitch and the slow twitch. So the slow twitch, they are reddish in color. The fast twitch are pale. So you can see those muscle fibers that are pale, those are the fast twitch. The slow twitch are reddish in color because they have a lot of myoglobin, they have a lot of blood capillaries that are supplying them with blood. They depend on aerobic system for energy. The fast twitch, they depend more on an aerobic system. So they don't need a lot of blood supply. They don't contain a lot of myoglobin, so they will look pale, okay? This table here is just differentiating the fast twitch and the slow twitch. You need to understand this table. So the characteristics of the skeletal muscle fiber types, the fast twitch and the slow twitch. So the slow twitch, they are high oxidative. The fast twitch, they are low oxidative and high. They are high in terms of glycolytic, okay, because they have a lot of glycogen-lactic acid system. So let's start. How can you differentiate them? So you have the characteristics that you'll be using to differentiate different types of skeletal muscle fibers. So in terms of the fiber diameter, the slow twitch are the smallest. So in terms of force of contraction, it's not that strong as compared to fast twitch because the fast twitch are larger in diameter. So the fast twitch, you have 2 types, the type 2A and the type 2B or the type 2X, depending on the textbooks you are using. So others will use type 2A and type 2B. Others will say type 2A and type 2X. It's just one and the same thing. So in terms of the size, the slow twitch are the smallest. Then the fast twitch type 2A, they are intermediate because they are in between the slow twitch and the fast twitch. So they are intermediate in terms of size. The type 2B, they are the largest. So in terms of force of contraction, the type 2B will generate a greater force of contraction. The myoglobin content, so the myoglobin content, the slow twitch will have high myoglobin content because they depend on aerobic processes. So you need myoglobin to transport oxygen. In the fast twitch type 2A is intermediate, so they will have a bit of myoglobin also. The fast twitch type 2B or type 2X, they have very low myoglobin because they don't really need oxygen. They will depend more on glycolysis, the source of energy. Mitochondria, whether you have less or more, so in type slow twitch or type 1, they will have more mitochondria because you need ATP. So in the mitochondria, that's where you need oxygen. So you find that they will have more mitochondria. The type 2A, it's intermediate, so they will contain a bit of mitochondria. Then the type 2B, they will have very few mitochondria. Capillaries, of course, slow twitch or type 1, they'll have more capillaries to transport oxygen to the tissue. And then the type 2A is intermediate, it's in between. The type 2B, they will have very few capillaries. That's why they look pale in color. The slow twitch or type 1, they will have more capillaries and then they look reddish in color. Metabolism, the type 1 or the slow twitch, they are high oxidative from the name itself. So they're going to have high aerobic capacity. They're using more of oxygen. So they'll be using more oxidative phosphorylation or aerobic processes. So they're very high aerobic capacity. The type 2A, they are intermediate. So they are going to be intermediate aerobic capacity, but very high in anaerobic capacity. The type 1 or the slow twitch, they are very low in anaerobic capacity. So they don't use much of glycolysis to generate ATP. Then the fast twitch type 2B, they are very low in aerobic capacity. They don't use more of the oxygen. then they are very high in terms of anaerobic capacity. So they'll be using more glycogen-lactic acid system. In terms of muscle fatigue, so the type 1, they are resistant to fatigue. Why? It's because they'll be using less of ATP, but they are producing more of ATP. Remember, we said the aerobic process is producing about 36 ATP. So there will be sufficient energy for muscle activity. So they'll be resistant to fatigue. But this fast twitch, because they're very fast, they're also using the oxygen very fast, then they are depending on glycolysis that doesn't produce a lot of ATP. You find that they are not resistant to fatigue. So the type 2B, they are not resistant to fatigue. They get fatigue so easily. Okay, so these muscles, which are big muscles that we use maybe to lift weights, you can't be lifting weights for hours because you get tired very easily. They're using a lot of energy, then they're very fast. The ATP activity is also very fast. So they will run out of energy and then there will be muscle fatigue. There will also be accumulation of metabolites, the waste products that can also bring about muscle fatigue. But the slow twitch, because they're using less ATP, then they're depending on aerobic processes that produces a lot of ATP. So you find that they are resistant to fatigue. You can stand for hours without getting tired. You can also walk for hours because they're using more of the slow twitch. So you understand that. The rate of ATP breakdown, so the type 1 will be the slowest. So they are slow. They are not using a lot of ATP. The fast twitch, from the name itself, they're using a lot of energy. So they're very fast to break down ATP. That's why they get tired so easily. So they get fatigued so easily. Then the glycogen concentration in type 1, you don't need a lot of glycolysis. So you have low glycogen concentration. Then the fast twitch, both you have a high concentration of glycogen because they're depending on glycogen-lactic acid system. So you need to break down glycogen to glucose, then to undergo glycolysis to produce ATP. That doesn't require oxygen. So those are anaerobic processes. That's why they are very high on anaerobic capacity. Then the location where you find these muscles. So the type 1, they are used for posture. So they are posture muscles. It means that there will be a lot of type 1 fibers in the lower part of the body as compared to the upper part. So the lower limbs will have more slow twitch. The upper limbs will have more of fast twitch. That's why you're using your hand to carry things. So when you're carrying things, you need more strength, very fast. So you find that the lower limbs will have more of slow twitch. The upper limbs will have more of fast twitch. In terms of function, the slow twitch or type 1, they are used for endurance activities and posture. So endurance activities or posture, maybe you are a marathon runner, you need to run 10 kilometers or 25 kilometers without stopping. So you need to endure that. So you'll be using slow twitch. So those slow twitch, they are using less energy, then they can sustain, they don't get so tired. You don't get tired so easily. So you find that you can endure that activity because you're using slow twitch. But for the fast twitch, they are used for rapid, intense movement of short duration. Maybe you want to run a 10 kilometers, not 10 kilometers, but maybe 100 meters, very fast. So if you're running 100 meters very fast, you'll be using more of fast twitch that will propel you very fast. So that's just the difference. So here it's basically the same, but I've just added color down there, the fiber diameter, the mitochondria and capillaries, but basically it's just the same information with the previous one. So you can see here that the slow oxidative fibers, which are type 1, they are red in color. Then the fast fibers or fast twitch fibers, we have two, type 2A and type 2B. So these are pale in color. So the first one is intermediate, so they will be red to pink. Then the fast twitch type 2B, they will be white or pale in color. So because they don't have much of capillaries. Okay, basically the information is the same. So you can see an example, slow twitch, you can find them in marathon runners. Then in fast twitch fibers, you can find them in sprinters like Usain Bolt. So you just want to run 100 meters. So even the bulkiness of the muscles, the fast twitch, you say the diameter is very big. So you can see that the muscle mass is very, very good in sprinters as compared to marathon runners. So marathon runner, you find that they'll be very slim. Then they will have more slow twitch fibers, which have got small diameter. So even the muscle mass will be smaller, but they can run for a long period of time. Then a sprinter can't run 2 kilometers at that speed. You will get tired very easily because they're using the muscle fibers that can get fatigued so easily. Okay. So depending on the activities that you are having, it's either you have more slow twitch or you have more fast twitch. If you are an average person who doesn't do exercises, you have maybe equal number of slow twitch and fast twitch. So depending on the activities, the marathon runners, they will have more slow twitch, which are red, then less of fast twitch. If you're a sprinter who's running 100 meters very fast, at a higher speed, you find that you have more of fast fibers, which are pale, and less of slow fibers, which are red. So depending on the activities you are doing, you can have an interchange of these fibers. Okay. So just summarizing the same different types of muscle fibers, skeletal muscle fibers. So you have the muscle fibers. You can name them using different properties. So according to the muscle twitch. So muscle twitch property, you can have slow and fast. So muscle twitch fibers properties, twitch properties is either you have slow twitch or fast twitch. Metabolic activities, the source of energy, whether it's oxidative or glycolytic. So the slow twitch, we say they're using more of oxygen, so they will be oxidative in terms of metabolic properties, oxidative. The fast twitch, you have two types. We have one that are intermediate, so they will be oxidative and glycolytic at the same time. Then we have type 2B that will be just glycolytic, mainly will be glycolytic. So name based on the twitch and metabolic properties. So name based on the twitch and metabolic properties. So you have slow twitch, so you can see slow oxidative. So SO, slow oxidative, you're combining the two. For the fast twitch, you have two types. We have the fast oxidative glycolytic, so form. So this is the type 2A. It's fast twitch, oxidative, and glycolytic at the same time. Then we have the type 2B, which are mainly glycolytic. So they are fast glycolytic. And then other nomenclature, you can say slow twitch or type 1. It's the same thing. Then you can have fast twitch type A, fast twitch type A, or fast twitch with capital letter A. This is another nomenclature. Then you also have fast twitch type B, fast twitch type B, capital letter B, or type 2B. The motor neurons that are innervating these muscle fibers, so the neuron type, the slow twitch, they're innervated by the alpha-2 motor neuron, which are smaller. So even the conductivity of action potential is slow. The twitch, the contraction will also be slow. Then you have the fast twitch that are innervated by alpha-1 motor neuron, which are larger, and even the conduction of action potential is very fast. The neuron size type 2, the alpha neuron type 2, they are small. The alpha neuron type 1, they are larger. So they are large in terms of size. The conduction in velocity is affected by the size. So the larger, the faster. The smaller, the slow. So the small ones, it will be slow. The larger ones will be fast in terms of conduction or velocity. Recruitment threshold, we say that the slow twitch are low, the fast twitch are high. So the first ones to be recruited are the slow twitch. So as you are starting to walk, you're using more of slow twitch fibers. Then when you realize to say you are getting late for a lecture, you need to start running. So you'll be recruiting even the fast twitch. Then you generate a greater force of contraction. And then you're able to run. Okay, so the first ones to be recruited are the slow twitch because they have a low threshold. And then later on, you can recruit the fast twitch fibers. The other properties of muscles, so let's look at summation, trapeze, and tetanus. A twitch is a single neural stimulation that will produce a single contraction or a twitch which lasts about 7 to 100 milliseconds. So a muscle twitch is a single stimulation that will produce a single contraction. That's called a muscle twitch. So sustained muscular contractions require many repeated stimuli. So if you want to sustain muscle contractions, you need to continuously stimulate the muscle to contract. So repeated stimuli will sustain muscle contractions. So you have multiple muscle twitch. The muscle twitch is divided into three phases of muscle twitch. The first phase is called the latent period, that is before contraction. So the action potential moves through the sarcolemma, causing calcium to be released, to say that calcium will be released and then to bring about a contraction. So the latent period, this is when the action potential is moving to stimulate a release of calcium. So it's called the latent period because this is before the contraction. Then phase 2 is called the contraction phase, whereby calcium is mobilized and then to build the tension, because to say calcium will go and bind to troponin. Then tropomyosin will move away, interaction or cross-bridge cycles that will bring about the actual contraction. So the phase 2 is called the contraction phase. Then the last phase of the twitch is called the relaxation. So there's a single stimulation that will produce a single contraction. Then you have relaxation phase, whereby calcium is pumped back to the subplasmic reticulum or is pumped back to the outside, depending on the muscle type. Then the concentration of calcium will reduce, the tropomyosin will hide the binding sites. And then once the binding sites are covered, the tension will fall. Then the muscle will relax. So these are the three phases of muscle twitch. So you have the latent period, the contraction phase, and the relaxation phase. So this is a diagram that is summarizing that. So you have the muscle tension and the time. This is not an action potential, it's the actual contraction. So the first phase is the latent period, the time of stimulation. So you can stimulate the muscle here, you won't immediately see the contraction because that action potential needs to be transmitted to the muscle. So the latent period, this is the spread of an action potential to the muscle. And then the muscle will be stimulated to contract. So the second phase is contraction phase. Then the last phase is a relaxation. When you're pumping back calcium to the subplasmic reticulum, the tension will start reducing. And then the muscle relax. So this is called a muscle twitch. Single stimulation that will produce a single contraction of the muscle. Then later on, it will relax. So the tension in a muscle, the duration of the tension, muscle twitch. So the duration of the muscle twitch is dependent on the size of the muscle fibers. So the larger the muscle fiber, the longer the muscle twitch. So you can see here, the eye muscle, they will just produce a very small muscle twitch or duration, a very small duration. Then if the muscle fiber is increasing, like the gastrocnemius muscle, the muscle twitch will last for a longer period. If the muscle is very big, like the soleus muscle, you can see it can last up to 100 milliseconds. So this is a very fast. Say a single contraction in the muscle after stimulation. Then the other thing that I would want you to understand is muscle trapeze. So muscle trapeze is a phenomenon in cardiac and skeletal muscles. The occurrence of successive increase in amplitude of the first few contraction of skeletal muscle that has received a number of stimuli of the same intensity following a quiescence period, also called the staircase phenomenon. So the staircase phenomenon is whereby when you're resting for a long time, much of the calcium from the sarcoplasm will be pumped into the subplasmic reticulum, like skeletal muscle cells. So right now I'm just seated preparing this lecture video. So much of the calcium is being pumped from the sarcoplasm of my cells into the sarcoplasmic reticulum for the storage. So now if I decide to make a movement, I need to mobilize calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the sarcoplasm so that it can go and bind to troponin C, moving the tropomyosin and covering the binding sites. So the first stimulation that will bring about muscle contraction will mobilize some of the calcium, but that concentration of calcium will start increasing depending on the multiple stimulation of the muscle fiber. So the first stimulation won't bring about a stronger contraction as compared to the second one. The second one, there'll be some residue of calcium that will remain in the sarcoplasm. So if there is some residue of calcium that is remaining in the sarcoplasm, then I stimulate this muscle to contract. That stimulation will stimulate more calcium to move from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The concentration will be more as compared to the previous one. So the second contraction will be stronger as compared to the previous one. The third contraction will be stronger as compared to the second one. The fourth contraction will be more stronger as compared to the third one. So it will produce a staircase, more like stairs. It will be moving up. So this is just a phenomena of residual calcium that remains. Another good example that I can give you, which is practical, is when you go and watch soccer, you'll find that there are players that are just seated outside waiting for their time, maybe a substitution or something like that. But when they're about to make a substitution, that player won't just join the pitch and start playing. They need to warm up. So during warm up, what happens is when they are seated on that bench, waiting for their opportunity to be given for them to play, much of the calcium is being pumped to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So muscle activities, it's not at their best at that level. But once they want to be given a chance to play, they need to exercise. As they are exercising, they will have the TREPI phenomenon, a staircase phenomenon, whereby as they are exercising there, warming up, there are some of the calcium residuals that will remain in the sarcoplasm. So once they enter the pitch, they will still have some residual calcium. So if they are stimulating those muscles to contract, they'll contract with a greater force. So their performance is going to increase because there will be some residual of calcium that will remain in the sarcoplasm. Okay, so this is the staircase phenomenon. So there is complete relaxation between the two twitch of the muscles, but the first muscle twitch won't be as strong as the second one. The second one won't be as strong as the third one. The fourth one, what I mean is, as you continue stimulating this muscle, the contraction will be increasing. The amplitude of contraction will be increasing. The first one is weak as compared to the second one. The second one is weak as compared to the third one. The third one is weak as compared to the fourth one. The fourth one is weak as compared to the fifth one. So this phenomenon is called a staircase. So in between the muscle twitch, there's complete relaxation. So during this period, it means that most of the calcium was pumped back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the first stimulus there tried to mobilize some calcium that brought about a muscle twitch, but this muscle twitch wasn't that strong because the concentration of calcium wasn't that much in the sarcoplasm. But if you don't waste much time, you stimulate this muscle fiber again, there'll be some calcium that will remain within the sarcoplasm. So that residual calcium plus this stimulation that is also stimulating more mobilization of calcium, the concentration of calcium will be more as compared to the previous one. That will stimulate a stronger contraction. So the second contraction will be stronger as compared to the first one. So it will form a staircase. So this is called TREPI. Okay. Wave summation is whereby the stimulation is very fast. The frequency of stimulating the muscle fiber is very fast. You are not allowing the muscle twitch to go to a resting state. So before it goes back to the resting state to stimulate it, then it will contract again. So increasing tension or summation of twitches occurs if a muscle is stimulated again before full relaxation. So before full relaxation of the muscle, you stimulate it. So you're not having TREPI there. There will be wave summation. Repeated stimulation before the end of the relaxation phase. So if the stimulus frequency is more than 50 stimulation per second, then you're going to have wave summation. So it's going to cause an increase in tension and summation of twitches. So this is different from tripping. So you can see here that before the first contraction goes back to the resting state, you stimulate it. So you're going to have another contraction. This contraction, before it's completely relaxed, you stimulate it again, you're going to have another contraction. So this is the summation of wave. So it's called wave summation, which is different from tripping. In tripping, in between the muscle twitch, there's complete relaxation. It goes back to the resting state. But in wave summation, you're not allowing this muscle to go back to the resting state. Then you stimulate it. So there will be wave summation, which you can appreciate here, which is different from tripping. Tetanic contractions. Tetanic contractions, it will always start with wave summation. So wave summation, there is no complete relaxation in between the muscle twitch. Then once those waves, they reach the maximum tension, then it's called tetanic contraction. Also called tetanized state or tetanus, occurs when a motor unit has been maximally stimulated by its motor neuron. So if you have maximum stimulation of the muscle fiber by the motor neuron, then you can have tetanic contractions. It occurs when muscles motor unit is stimulated by multiple impulses at a sufficient high frequency. If the stimuli are delivered at a high frequency, the twitches will overlap, resulting in tetanic contractions. When tetanized, the contracting tension in the muscle remains constant in a steady state. This is the maximal possible contraction. So you're going to have the maximal possible contraction because there is multiple stimulation of the muscles, so they're not relaxing. They will continue contracting. So you can see it will start as a wave summation, then the tension in the muscles becomes constant. So you can see that the tension has become constant. There is partial relaxation. So this is called incomplete tetanus. So incomplete tetanus, if rapid stimulation continues and the muscle is not allowed to relax, twitches reach maximum level of tension. So this is called incomplete. There's a bit of relaxation, but it's not going to the resting state. If there is nothing, if the muscle fibers are not relaxing at all, it's called complete tetanus here. So if we increase the stimulation so much that the muscle is not allowed to relax, even partial relaxation, there will be maximum contraction in the muscle. There is no kind of relaxation at all that you can see here. The muscle will just continue contracting, and this is called complete tetanus. If stimulation frequencies are high enough, muscle never begins to relax, and the contraction is continuous. So you can see here, once the contraction is continuous, there is no kind of relaxation at any point. This is called complete tetanus. Then once after complete tetanus, the muscle will undergo fatigue. So the muscle will be fatigued. So you can see here that the muscles become very weak because there will be accumulation of metabolites. You can also result into using of all the ATP. So the muscle becomes very tired and fatigued. Then it will relax. So you can see here, the muscles become weak. So this is called muscle fatigue. So this table is just summarizing everything that we've discussed. We have muscle twitch, single stimulation that results into a single contraction in relaxation. This is called a muscle twitch. So if you just have a single stimulation and a single contraction in relaxation, that are referred to as muscle twitch. Okay, so if there is a period of quiescence or maybe no muscle activities, and then you start stimulating the muscles, you can have trippy phenomenon whereby the first contraction will be weak as compared to the second one. The third one will be even strong as compared to the previous one. The fourth one will be strong as compared to the third one. but there is a complete relaxation in between the muscle twitch. So this is called a staircase. Okay. Then if you are increasing the frequency of stimulating the muscles, you find that you are going to produce maximum tension in these muscle fibers. So if there is partial relaxation between the twitch, it's called incomplete tetanus. But if there is no relaxation, it's called complete tetanus. And then this will result into muscle fatigue. Muscle twitch, there is latent period where the action potential is being spread to the muscles. Then to mobilize calcium, that will bring about a contraction phase. Then calcium is pumped back to the supraspinal reticulum, and then to bring about the relaxation phase. So these are the phases of muscle twitch: single stimulation, single contraction, and relaxation. Wave summation, if you are not allowing the muscle fibers or the twitches to go back to the resting state, and then you stimulate again, you're going to have wave summation. If you're producing maximum tension, then you have incomplete tetanus as long as there's partial relaxation. That is not going back to the resting state, but there's just partial relaxation in between the muscle twitch, but the tension is maximum, they need to be incomplete tetanus. But if the muscle fibers are not relaxed at any point, they are not allowing partial relaxation of the muscle fibers, then that becomes complete tetanus, and then the muscle becomes very weak. So the difference here is the frequency of stimulating. Once we are increasing the frequency of stimulating the muscle fibers, and then it can go into tetanus. But I told you to say that the myocardium can never be tetanized. Why? It's because the absolute refractory period is prolonged during the plateau phase. Remember the phase 2 in the myocardial action potential. There is a plateau phase that is going to prolong the absolute refractory period. So even if you increase the frequency, that muscle fiber is not going to respond. So cardiac muscle cells can never be tetanized, but skeletal muscle cells can. Okay, so this marks the end of muscle physiology. Thank you very much for your time. You are ready.